A jaded bank teller dismisses a young couple based on her assumptions, only to face a life-altering moment when a mysterious hooded man walks in just before closing time. With fear gripping her, Janet must confront the consequences of her prejudice, because the person she treated unfairly might be the only one who can save her. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the bank, casting long rays across the sleek, polished floors. It was a busy day, with customers bustling in and out, trying to handle their financial affairs before the weekend. At one of the teller's counters stood Janet, a seasoned employee, known for her efficiency, but also for her sharp tongue and judgmental tendencies. She'd been working at the bank for over a decade and had developed her own internal radar for people, though it was often clouded by biases she wasn't even aware she had. Janet scanned the growing line in front of her counter, feeling the pressure of the long shift weighing down on her. Then, a young couple stepped forward, their turn finally arriving after waiting quietly. David, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, wore an easygoing expression. His fiancée, Melanie, stood beside him, wearing a casual blouse and leggings, glancing at her phone as they approached. Janet's eyes flicked over them, her mind already jumping to conclusions. They didn't look wealthy. Not by her standards. She'd seen enough people in her career to make judgments within seconds. Probably here to cash a small check or ask for change, she thought, suppressing a sigh. David stepped up to the counter, his smile polite but a little reserved. "Hi, we'd like to deposit this amount into our savings account," he said, handing over a slip along with his identification card. Janet glanced at the deposit slip and then back at David, raising an eyebrow. The amount was significant, more than most people deposited in cash. For a second, she hesitated, her trained instincts kicking in. "Are you sure this is the right account?" she asked, her tone slightly patronizing. "That's a lot of money." David blinked, caught off guard by the comment, but keeping his composure. "Yes, it's correct," he replied. "It's our joint savings." Melanie looked up from her phone and caught the subtle change in Janet's expression, a look of skepticism, as if she doubted they could legitimately own that much money. Melanie felt a wave of irritation building inside her, but decided to hold back, not wanting to make a scene. Janet scrutinized David's ID, turning it over as if searching for signs of forgery. Then she typed the account number into the system, her fingers tapping a little too slowly on the keyboard, making it clear she wasn't in a hurry to help. "Where exactly did this money come from?" Janet asked casually, though the question carried a heavy implication. David gave a small, incredulous laugh, masking his discomfort. "It's from a business sale I finalized. I'm a software developer." Melanie, unable to stay silent any longer, leaned in slightly, her voice sharp but controlled. "Is there a problem? You're treating us like we did something wrong." Janet raised her eyebrows in mock surprise. "Oh no, no problem at all," she said, though the forced politeness in her voice was unmistakable. "I just need to verify everything, that's all. You understand, I'm sure." David placed a hand on Melanie's arm, a silent signal to keep calm. "Let's just get this done," he whispered to her, not wanting the situation to escalate. Janet continued her work, but her movements were slow and deliberate, as if she were trying to send a message. Customers behind the couple started shifting uncomfortably, aware that something was off but unsure of what exactly. A woman 2 counters down shot the couple a sympathetic look, sensing the tension. Melanie clenched her jaw, struggling to keep her composure. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. Finally, Janet handed the ID back to David with a tight-lipped smile. "All set. I just had to double-check, you know. We have to be careful these days." David accepted his ID without a word, but his eyes held a flicker of disappointment. He had expected better, hoped for better, but he wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time he and Melanie had been treated this way, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Melanie, however, wasn't one to let things slide easily. "I hope this isn't how you treat all your customers," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Janet's smile didn't waver, though the edges of it tightened. "Of course not. Just doing my job." David nudged Melanie gently, signaling it was time to go. With a final glance at Janet, he turned and walked toward the door, Melanie following reluctantly. As they left, the couple's exit was marked by the kind of silence that follows a storm, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Once they were gone, Janet exhaled, as if releasing the frustration she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. She felt justified in her actions, telling herself she had done the right thing. Better to be cautious than sorry, she thought. In her mind, she was protecting the bank from potential fraud, even if it meant stepping on a few toes along the way. Her coworker, Lisa, who had been observing the interaction from a nearby station, shook her head quietly. When the next lull in customers arrived, she leaned over the divider to talk to Janet. "You know, you really didn't have to be like that with them," Lisa said, her voice low and concerned. Janet shrugged, brushing off the comment. "I was just being careful. You never know with people these days." Lisa gave her a pointed look. "That's the thing. You don't know. Maybe next time, just think about that." Janet waved her off, unwilling to engage in the conversation further. In her mind, it was just another interaction in a long day filled with them. "They'll get over it," she thought dismissively. "People like that always do." But even as she told herself that, there was a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind, a voice she chose to ignore. The bank's automatic doors slid shut behind David and Melanie, sealing them out of the building and into the bright afternoon sunlight. Melanie shook her head in disbelief, still fuming over the encounter. "Can you believe that?" she asked, her voice simmering with frustration. "She treated us like we were criminals." David gave a tired sigh. "It's not worth it, Mel. Let it go." "Why should I?" "It's not fair," she shot back. "We've worked hard for everything we have, and we still get treated like this." David placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know," he said softly, "but fighting every battle isn't worth it. Let's just go." Reluctantly, Melanie nodded, though her anger didn't entirely dissipate. As they walked away from the bank, the couple carried the weight of yet another encounter with Prejudice, a weight that felt heavier with each passing day. Inside the bank, Janet resumed her work as if nothing had happened, unaware that this seemingly insignificant interaction would set off a series of events that would change her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above as Janet settled back at her station, trying to shake off the interaction with David and Melanie. She told herself it wasn't a big deal, just another interaction among many she'd had over the years. Still, the encounter left her feeling uneasy in ways she couldn't fully explain. She had dismissed Lisa's words, but a tiny part of her knew that maybe, just maybe, there was some truth in them. The day dragged on as more customers filtered through the bank, some friendly, others impatient. Janet handled them with her usual mix of efficiency and cool detachment, though she found herself thinking about David and Melanie more than she wanted to. Their expressions, disappointed, frustrated, and resigned, kept flashing in her mind. Why do people have to make everything so difficult? She thought irritably. She had always prided herself on being a no-nonsense professional. If people just acted properly, these things wouldn't happen. But even as she justified her behavior, small irritations began to pile up. The bank's system suddenly crashed, slowing down every transaction. Long lines formed at the counters, and customers grew visibly impatient. Janet forced herself to smile through gritted teeth, but every moment felt heavier than the last. Her manager, Mr. Perkins, leaned out of his office, glancing at the growing line. "What's going on, Janet? We need to move these customers along." "I'm doing the best I can," Janet replied, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Well, do better," Perkins muttered before retreating into his office. Janet clenched her jaw and resumed her work, the stress building with each passing minute. A particularly grumpy older man gave her an earful about the delay, and a young mother with 2 crying toddlers demanded that Janet process her request faster. By the time her lunch break arrived, Janet felt like she was at the end of her rope. She practically stormed into the break room, tossing her things onto the table with more force than necessary. The space was empty. Giving her a brief moment of solitude, she leaned over the counter to pour herself a cup of coffee, but just as she lifted it to her mouth, the cup slipped from her hand, splashing hot liquid all over her blouse. "Seriously?" Janet groaned, grabbing a napkin to blot the stain. It was one of those small, frustrating moments that felt like the last straw on an already bad day. To make things worse, her sandwich order from the cafe down the street was wrong. She had asked for turkey on whole wheat, but the sandwich was ham on rye. Two things she hated. She stared at the offending sandwich, feeling a wave of exasperation. Of course, this would happen today. Janet pushed the sandwich away, suddenly not hungry anymore. As she sat in the quiet of the break room, she thought again about the young couple from earlier. The look on Melanie's face as they left the bank stayed with her. Anger, but also something else. Disappointment. It was a look Janet was familiar with, though she hated to admit it. She thought back to the times she'd encountered subtle prejudices in her own life. As a woman, she'd dealt with her share of condescending customers and dismissive managers. She knew what it was like to feel judged unfairly, though she rarely acknowledged it out loud. Maybe I was a little harsh on them, she thought grudgingly, but she quickly brushed the thought away. I was just doing my job. They'll get over it. When her break ended, Janet returned to her station, still annoyed but determined to get through the rest of the day. She sat down, adjusted her chair, and tried to refocus on the tasks at hand, but the universe seemed determined to test her patience. The computer system froze again just as she was processing a complicated wire transfer, forcing her to start over from scratch. A middle-aged woman at the counter gave her an irritated look, tapping her fingernails on the marble surface. Is this going to take much longer? The woman asked, her tone sharp. Janet forced a tight-lipped smile. Just a moment, ma'am. The system's acting up. Of course it is, the woman muttered under her breath, loud enough for Janet to hear. By the time the system was back online, Janet was mentally counting down the hours until she could go home. She glanced at the clock. Still 3 hours left. It felt like an eternity. Lisa, the coworker who had witnessed Janet's earlier interaction with David and Melanie, approached her during a lull between customers. She leaned casually against the counter, giving Janet a knowing look. Rough day, huh? Lisa said with a sympathetic smile. You have no idea, Janet replied, rubbing her temples. Lisa tilted her head thoughtfully. You know, I've noticed that bad days tend to get worse when you start off on the wrong foot. Janet gave her a skeptical look. What's that supposed to mean? Lisa shrugged. Just saying, maybe if we start the day with a little more kindness, things might go smoother. Janet rolled her eyes. Right. Like kindness would stop the computer from crashing. Lisa laughed softly. Fair point, but it might make dealing with everything else a bit easier. Janet didn't respond. She wasn't in the mood for life lessons, especially not today. As Lisa walked away, Janet found herself thinking about what her coworker had said. She hated to admit it, but there was a tiny part of her that wondered if she really could have handled things differently, with David and Melanie, and with the other customers she'd encountered throughout the day. Does it even matter? She thought warily. People are going to be difficult no matter what I do. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling heavier than the last. By the time the bank's closing hour approached, Janet was exhausted, both physically and mentally. All she wanted was to get through the last few customers and go home to the quiet comfort of her apartment. But as the final customers trickled in, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Like the weight of the day wasn't just stress, but a kind of build-up, a tension waiting to snap. As the clock ticked toward closing time, Janet glanced at the door, hoping no more customers would come in at the last minute. But just as she allowed herself a brief sigh of relief, the automatic doors slid open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man in a hooded jacket, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Janet's stomach tightened slightly. There was something about the way he moved, quick and deliberate, that put her on edge. She straightened in her chair, trying to suppress the unease creeping over her. It's just another customer, she told herself. Don't overthink it. But deep down, Janet knew the day was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. The atmosphere in the bank shifted the moment the hooded man stepped inside. Janet's instincts kicked in. Something about him felt wrong. He moved with a sense of urgency, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, and his gaze flitted nervously around the room. Janet stiffened at her station, her pulse quickening. She had seen her share of strange customers over the years, but this one sent a chill down her spine. The man approached her counter with purpose, his steps silent but deliberate. The remaining customers in the bank seemed oblivious, focused on finishing their business and heading home. Janet's heart raced as the man stopped in front of her, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. "Hey," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "I need you to do something for me." Janet tried to keep her voice steady, but she could feel the fear clawing at her throat. "How can I help you?" she asked, forcing a smile that felt painfully tight. The man leaned in closer, his eyes darting toward the entrance as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then, with a quick motion, he pulled something from his pocket, an object wrapped in his hand. From her angle, Janet couldn't tell what it was, but it was small and black, and her mind instantly filled with worst-case scenarios. "Listen carefully," the man whispered, his tone cold and commanding. "I need everything you've got. Now." Janet's breath hitched. Her hands instinctively moved to the keyboard in front of her, her fingers trembling as she tried to comply. She didn't know if the object in his hand was a weapon or just a bluff, but she wasn't about to take any chances. The fear felt suffocating, clouding her thoughts as she fumbled with the cash drawer. I need a moment," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression darkened. "No moments. Just do it. Now." Janet's mind raced. She thought about pressing the silent alarm under the counter, but her hand froze, paralyzed by the fear that if she made one wrong move, things could escalate in ways she couldn't control. The weight of all her decisions from earlier that day crashed down on her like a tidal wave. In that moment, she understood, truly understood, how it felt to be on the other side of power. Helpless, vulnerable, trapped. The same way she had made David and Melanie feel earlier, when she questioned their intentions and treated them like criminals without cause. Janet's throat felt dry, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The man tapped the counter impatiently, growing more agitated with every passing second. She could feel the pressure mounting, her hands shaking as she tried to collect herself. Just as she opened the cash drawer, the sound of the automatic doors sliding open filled the room. Janet glanced up, her heart leaping into her throat. It was David. The same David she had dismissed and mistreated earlier that day. He stepped inside the bank with a calm, measured stride, his gaze immediately locking onto the man at her counter. Janet's breath caught in her chest. She couldn't believe it. The man who had every reason to ignore her distress had just walked into what could be a dangerous situation. The hooded man stiffened as David approached, clearly uneasy. It was as if David's presence disrupted whatever plan he had in mind. "Hey," David said calmly, his voice steady and without fear. "What's going on here?" The hooded man shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around whatever he was holding. For a moment, Janet thought she saw recognition flicker in the man's eyes, like he knew David from somewhere. "Not your business," the man muttered, though his bravado seemed to falter under David's gaze. David took another step forward, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "Look, man, this isn't the place to do something you'll regret," he said quietly. "Let's just walk out of here. No need to make things worse." Janet held her breath, watching the interaction unfold. She was amazed at how composed David seemed, as if he had dealt with situations like this before. His presence was calm, almost reassuring, in a way that defied the tension in the air. The hooded man hesitated, his eyes flicking between David and Janet. For a moment, it seemed like he was weighing his options, caught between the desire to follow through with whatever plan he had and the strange, unspoken understanding that David seemed to offer him. "Come on," David urged gently. "Let's go. It's not worth it." The hooded man let out a frustrated sigh, as if the fight had drained out of him. With one last glance at Janet, he stuffed the object back into his pocket. Janet never saw what it was, and muttered under his breath, "Fine, whatever." He turned abruptly and walked toward the exit, his steps heavy with defeat. David didn't follow him, just watched silently as the man pushed through the doors and disappeared into the evening. Janet sat frozen at her counter, her hands still trembling from the encounter. The fear that had gripped her moments earlier slowly began to dissolve, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief and disbelief. David turned back to Janet, his expression calm but unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Janet could barely manage a nod, her mind still reeling from what had just happened. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I think so." David gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Good." He paused, glancing toward the door where the hooded man had vanished. "I'm glad everything worked out." Janet stared at him, struggling to process the fact that this man, the same man she had treated so poorly earlier, had just saved her from a potentially dangerous situation. Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. David shrugged, his expression kind but distant. "Because it was the right thing to do." With that, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Janet sitting at her counter, still trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. For a long moment, she remained frozen in place, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. She had spent the entire day convinced that she could judge people by their appearances, that she could decide who was trustworthy and who wasn't, based on nothing more than her own assumptions. And yet, the man she had misjudged, dismissed even, was the one who had come to her rescue when she needed help the most. As David disappeared through the sliding doors, Janet felt something shift inside her. Something that she couldn't quite name, but knew would change her forever. The doors closed behind David with a soft whoosh, leaving Janet alone in the eerie stillness of the bank lobby. Her heart still hammered in her chest, and her hands refused to stop trembling. She gripped the counter to steady herself, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling through her. Fear, relief, confusion, and shame. It felt like the ground beneath her had shifted, leaving her in unfamiliar territory. Her coworkers slowly began to approach, having sensed that something strange had just happened. Lisa, the friendly teller who had earlier tried to talk to Janet about kindness, was the first to speak. "Janet," she asked, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay? What happened just now?" Janet gave a small, shaky nod. I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Mr. Perkins, the manager, emerged from his office, glancing toward the door where the hooded man had exited. "Who was that guy? Do we need to call the police?" "No," Janet said quickly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "He's gone now. No harm done." Lisa furrowed her brow, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but she didn't push. Janet knew that if she tried to explain what had just happened, it would sound unbelievable, even to herself. The man she had judged as nothing more than an ordinary customer had stepped into a moment of crisis and diffused it without hesitation, without anger, without anything in return. Lisa gave Janet a soft pat on the shoulder. "Take a few minutes if you need to," she offered kindly before returning to her counter. Janet nodded absently, though she had no idea how a few minutes would be enough to wrap her mind around what had just occurred. Later, when the bank finally closed for the day, Janet sat at her station, replaying the events in her mind. She couldn't shake the memory of the way David had looked at her, calm, composed, without a trace of resentment or anger. He had every reason to ignore her distress, to walk away, to let her fend for herself. But instead, he had helped. Not because he owed her anything, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her sister, asking how her day had gone. Janet stared at the message, struggling to find an answer that made sense. How could she explain that a man she disrespected had just saved her from what could have been a terrible situation? That a moment of kindness from a stranger had shaken her to her core? She put the phone down without replying, feeling a knot tighten in her chest. It wasn't just embarrassment she felt, it was shame. Deep, gnawing shame for the way she had treated David and Melanie. She thought back to the condescending way she had questioned David about his deposit, the dismissive look she had given Melanie. It hadn't seemed like a big deal at the time, just a routine interaction, one of many she had throughout her day. But now, in the quiet aftermath of what had happened, it felt different. It felt wrong. Janet rested her elbows on the counter and buried her face in her hands. "Why do I do this?" she wondered. "Why do I assume the worst about people?" It was a question she didn't have an answer for, and the more she thought about it, the heavier it felt. She had spent years building walls around herself, using judgment and detachment as armor to protect herself from the world. But now, those walls felt suffocating, trapping her in a prison of her own making. She glanced at the security cameras overhead, wondering if anyone else had truly seen what had transpired between her, David, and the hooded man. Would anyone believe her if she told them the full story? Would it even matter if they did? In the end, it wasn't about what other people thought. It was about what she thought of herself. And right now, she didn't like what she saw. The next morning, Janet arrived at the bank earlier than usual. She sat at her desk, staring at her reflection in the darkened computer screen, feeling the weight of everything that had happened the day before. She knew she had a choice to make. She could continue as she always had, judging, assuming, treating people like problems to be solved. Or she could do something different. She didn't know if it would make a difference. She didn't know if people would notice or care. But she knew that she had to try. Later that afternoon, David and Melanie returned to the bank. They had called ahead to finalize their deposit, and Janet knew they would be arriving soon. She had spent the entire morning thinking about what she would say, rehearsing the words in her mind. When the couple stepped through the doors, Janet felt her heart skip a beat. David wore the same easygoing expression as before, though there was a hint of wariness in his eyes, as if he wasn't sure what kind of reception to expect. Melanie stood beside him, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. Janet took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hi," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "Thank you for coming back. I wanted to say—" She hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "I'm really sorry about the way I treated you both the other day. I shouldn't have been so dismissive or skeptical. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." David's expression softened slightly, though he remained quiet, giving Janet the space to finish. "I let my assumptions get the best of me." Janet continued, feeling the words come easier now. "And that's not how I want to treat people. I'm trying to be better." For a moment, there was silence between them. Melanie glanced at David, as if waiting to see how he would respond. Then, to Janet's surprise, David offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you for saying that," he said simply. "It means a lot." Melanie gave a small nod, her expression still cautious but not unkind. "We appreciate the apology," she said quietly. Janet felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew that one apology wouldn't undo everything. But it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Hopeful that she could change, that she could be better. As the couple finalized their transaction and prepared to leave, Janet watched them go, feeling lighter than she had in months. She knew she still had a long way to go, but she was ready to try. And that, she realized, was the most important part. The days that followed were different for Janet. Something inside her had shifted, an awareness she couldn't ignore. The old routine of coming to work, clocking in, and treating people with mechanical efficiency now felt strange, as if it belonged to someone else. She began to notice things she hadn't before. The subtle looks of wariness on customers' faces, the slight tremors of anxiety in some voices, and the tension that often came from people simply trying to be understood. The encounter with David and Melanie, and especially David's unexpected act of kindness, had opened a door Janet hadn't realized existed. It wasn't just about one apology or one good deed. It was about seeing people as individuals, each carrying stories she knew nothing about. She still thought about David often, wondering how he had stayed so calm that day, how he had shown her compassion even after she had judged him unfairly. It haunted her in a way, but it also inspired her to do better, not because she wanted redemption, but because she finally understood the importance of empathy. A week after their last visit, Janet was sitting at her counter during a slow morning when her manager, Mr. Perkins, approached. His face was neutral, but there was a curious look in his eyes. "You got a letter," he said, handing her an envelope with her name scrawled on it. "From a customer, I think." Janet took the envelope, her heart fluttering with apprehension. Letters from customers were rare. Most people gave feedback directly to managers or left reviews online. She turned the envelope over in her hands, then slowly opened it. Inside was a neatly folded piece of paper, along with a short, handwritten note. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was David's. The note read, "Dear Janet, thank you for taking the time to apologize to us. It wasn't something you had to do, and it meant more than you know. We all carry burdens that others can't see, and sometimes those burdens make us react poorly to the world around us. I've had my share of moments where I misjudged people too, so I know it isn't always easy to change. What matters is that you tried. And that's something not everyone has the courage to do. Thank you again for making the effort to see us differently. I hope that kindness will come back to you in ways you don't expect. All the best, David and Melanie. Janet sat quietly, her fingers gripping the note as a lump formed in her throat. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. It was a reminder that change, real change, was possible, even in small moments. And it confirmed what she had already begun to realize. Kindness has a way of circling back, just like the unkindness she had shown had come back to confront her. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her drawer, feeling the weight of it in her heart. It was the kind of weight she didn't mind carrying, a reminder to be better. The next few weeks passed by, and Janet found herself approaching her job with a new sense of purpose. She slowed down, taking the time to connect with customers, instead of rushing through interactions. When people were irritable or impatient, she tried to respond with patience instead of defensiveness. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when she slipped back into old habits, times when her temper flared, or when her judgments resurfaced before she could stop them. But each time, she remembered David's calm expression and Melanie's cautious but sincere nod, and she reminded herself to start again. Her coworkers noticed the change too. Lisa, in particular, gave Janet a knowing smile one afternoon after witnessing her calmly handle a particularly difficult customer. "You're doing good, Janet," Lisa said quietly. Janet smiled back, a little embarrassed by the praise but grateful nonetheless. "I'm trying," she admitted. Lisa chuckled. "That's all any of us can do." One rainy afternoon, as the bank neared closing time, Janet found herself thinking about the hooded man who had come in that fateful day. She wondered what had driven him to the brink. What circumstances had led him to consider something so desperate? She thought about David's words that day. "This isn't the place to do something you'll regret." It occurred to her that David hadn't just saved her that day. He might have saved the hooded man too. And in a strange way, that realization gave her a sense of peace. Months later, Janet was working a quiet shift when a familiar face walked through the doors. It was Melanie, alone this time, carrying a small package. She spotted Janet at the counter and gave her a hesitant smile as she approached. "Hi," Melanie said. "I wanted to drop this off for you." Janet blinked in surprise. "For me?" Melanie nodded, placing the package on the counter. "It's just a little something from David and me. We thought you might like it." Janet carefully opened the package to find a small potted plant, a succulent, neatly nestled in a ceramic pot. Attached to it was a tiny card that read, "Growth takes time." Janet stared at the plant, her throat tightening with emotion. It was such a simple gift, yet it carried a profound message, one that resonated deeply with the journey she had been on since that day at the bank. "Thank you," Janet whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. Melanie gave her a small, understanding smile. "You're welcome." As Melanie turned to leave, Janet watched her go, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Janet placed the succulent on the corner of her desk, where it caught the soft light filtering through the bank's windows. Every day, she watered it just enough, knowing that growth couldn't be rushed. It was a lesson she was still learning, one she would carry with her, one small act of kindness at a time. And with each passing day, Janet found herself changing, not in leaps and bounds, but in small, meaningful ways. Because she knew now that the way she treated people mattered, not just to them, but to herself. In the end, it wasn't just about making things right with David and Melanie. It was about becoming the kind of person she wanted to be, a person who could see beyond appearances, beyond assumptions, and find the humanity in everyone she met. And as she watered the plant one quiet morning, Janet realized that growth, like kindness, had a way of coming full circle, exactly when you least expected it. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.